Hey, in this video I'm going to show you guys and talk about my Sega Saturn collection. The Saturn has increasingly become one of my favorite retro consoles over the past several years. And not that I have too many games, but I think this video is going to take a while, I anticipate. So I've decided to split up the video into two parts. This one's going to showcase my US Saturn collection, and I'm going to release a video at the same time that showcases my Japanese games. And unlike my previous collection videos where I just kind of point the camera at game boxes, I recorded some game footage for each of my Saturn games, and I'm going to put clips of them as I talk about each game, just to make the video a little more interesting visually, and to give you guys a better sense of what these games look and play like. But yeah, let's get on with the video. Alright, so this is a Sega console, of course, so we gotta start with a Sonic game, and here we have Sonic Jam. Sonic Jam is basically a collection of the Genesis or Mega Drive, if you will, Sonic games. So Sonic 1, 2, 3, and Knuckles. And in addition to that, they made some additions. They made kind of a remixed mode where they made slight changes to each game. They hacked in the spin dash into the original Sonic the Hedgehog, which obviously wasn't in the original Genesis game. And they added an easy mode for each game to, as the mode might suggest, make the games a little easier because they are pretty difficult, especially your first time playing through them. So it is a pretty neat collection, I would say. The game is pretty pricey for what it is, though. So if you're just looking to play the original Sonic games, I would recommend just getting the Genesis or Mega Drive games, or one of the many Sonic collections that have come out in recent years. But more interesting, to me anyway, is that Sonic Jam also has this additional mode called Sonic World, I believe. And it's basically a 3D environment that you can get to play in. And you can just walk around and collect rings and go in water and do mini tasks and stuff. And it's really neat because, well, I guess we should get into it now. The Saturn did not have a true Sonic game on the system, which is crazy to think about because Sonic was the breakout franchise for Sega for the previous generation, the Genesis and Mega Drive. And there are tons of Sonic games for all their systems. You know, the Genesis, between the Genesis, the Game Gear, the Master System, the Sega CD, even the 32X with Knuckles Chaotix. So they knew that Sonic was a big franchise for them, and due to internal struggles which ultimately plagued Sega throughout the rest of their life between the US and Japanese branches, they never got to release a real Sonic game. They were working on a game called Sonic Extreme, but it never came out. But the Sonic Jam Sonic World mode is the closest we're ever going to get to kind of seeing what a 3D Sonic game would be like had it come out on the Saturn. And it's pretty neat. I like the look of Sonic. I like the look of the environments. Like I said, there's nothing too crazy going on. It's kind of a tech demo in a way. One of the neat things is that you can kind of walk into different areas. Like you can walk into a building where you can see kind of concept art and the commercials for the various Sonic games. So it is kind of a museum for Sonic, the Sonic Jam package. So in that sense, I really respect it. They kind of understood the importance of the older Sonic games and allowed people to play them again in a new way. But like I said, given the price, I don't know if Sonic Jam is worth it unless you're really interested in the Sonic World mode, and even that won't take a lot of your time. But yeah, it is a pretty decent game and a decent collection for Sonic fans. And next up we have another Sonic game, Sonic R. This is a Sonic racing game where you kind of race on foot with each Sonic character. And unfortunately, it's not a very good game at all. It's very unfinished, or at least it seems unfinished to me. I already recorded the footage before making this video, so you're probably looking at me doing really badly in the race that I'm in. And it's not because I'm intentionally trying to look bad. It's just that I haven't played it in a while, and the controls are so weird. and it's really hard to maneuver your character, so you just end up crashing and going off course a lot of the time. But it is kind of an interesting game because, kind of with the Sonic Jam, Sonic World, it is Sonic in 3D, which is still kind of novel back then, and there are a lot of weird environments. The stages make it so that you can kind of explore a little bit and find new secrets, which I like. But most importantly for Sonic R, the only reason why I would ever play this game again, and occasionally I do pop this game in, is because of the incredibly cheesy yet amazing vocal soundtrack that plays, when you're racing. It's just this woman who's singing these extremely, positive and optimistic sounding pop songs, and it's just amazing to me. But other than that, like with pretty much every Saturn game, Sonic R is also fairly expensive. I think it's around $50, which for a Saturn game isn't that expensive, sadly. But for most people, I would say $50 for this kind of game is way too much. They did re-release this on the GameCube, Sonic Gems Collection, and Xbox Live Arcade, and possibly PS3 as well. But the game is out there if you want to play it for cheap. But I would not say this is a good game, unfortunately. And the final Sonic game we have is Sonic 3D Blast. So this game was released on the Genesis under the same title. It's kind of this isometric 3D quote-unquote Sonic game where basically your goal is to collect these birds by defeating various enemies and then putting them in this ring thing to advance. So it's nothing too crazy, and I would say most people don't even like this game. I think it's an okay game, but the problem is with the Saturn version, it's literally the same game. Well, not literally, but for the most part it is. I think it has like some extra mini games, and the soundtrack is different. The soundtrack is actually pretty good. The new soundtrack. I like the original Genesis one as well. It's kind of a different flavor. But other than that, it's the same game. It's a disappointing release. It is a very cheap game, so if you're dying to play Saturn games, I guess this is one of the first ones you could get for a decent price. So, not really much to say since it is a port, but like I said, a pretty disappointing game overall. For the Saturn, anyway. Alright, and next up we have kind of the franchise they launched the Saturn with, Panzer Dragoon. Like I said, this came out at launch, at least in the US. I don't know if it came out in the Japanese launch, but in the US it did launch with the system. Of course, many of you know that the Saturn had kind of a stealth launch in the US where the system was announced at E3, and then they said it's coming out right now, and only a few retailers knew about it, and it kind of pissed off other retailers, and there was no ad campaign, obviously, so people were kind of overwhelmed, and it was an expensive console, so that was one of the many, many reasons why the Saturn failed. I'll get into more of those reasons later. We've already kind of detailed the Sonic thing, which was kind of a major mess up for them, and the launch. But in terms of Panzer Dragoon itself, it's a rail shooter, a 3D rail shooter like Space Harrier or Star Fox or Sin and Punishment, sort of. Where you're this human on top of a dragon and you shoot enemies in a 360-degree plane. You can kind of turn in 90-degree quadrants, and you have to look at the radar to see where the enemies are, and you can kind of move around accordingly. And it is a pretty simple game, and it's not a very long game. And I think that's another problem that Sega, as a first-party publisher, had. I think they were still in that arcade mentality, while their competition was making more kind of, for lack of a better term, console experiences. The games we kind of remember from that 32, 64-bit generation was Mario 64, Ocarina of Time, Metal Gear Solid, Final Fantasy VII, Tomb Raider. And meanwhile, Sega was making these kind of arcade experiences that you could kind of play through for a little bit and move on from. So I think they kind of misread the market in a way. But the thing I like about retro consoles is that you can kind of remove yourself from those initial expectations. Like, who cares that people wanted quote unquote richer experiences back then? We can kind of look at the Saturn library for what it is, and it has a lot of great games. So I don't know, like the fact that it didn't meet people's expectations like is no longer relevant is what I'm trying to say. And I think now people are appreciating the Saturn more and more for its pick up and play games, and which is kind of how we want our retro games to be. We want games we can just pick up. We don't have to learn the controls. We don't know what to do immediately. And I think the Saturn kind of embodies that, which is why I like it. But sorry, I've kind of been going on tangents lately. But yeah, Panzer Dragoon. I love the look of it. It has that kind of ambitious Saturn 3D, which a lot of people don't like, but I really love the way that some of the better 3D Saturn games look. They really overachieved because the Saturn was mostly a 2D machine, but some of the developers were able to make really impressive looking 3D games on it, which I like. It has a really great atmosphere to it. It has this made up Panzer Dragoon language. And it takes its story very seriously, which is kind of funny for a rail shooter in comparison to something like Star Fox, where the characters are really kind of fun and the dialogue is fun and everything's kind of crazy. But yeah, it's a good game. I think the problem is that it's pretty difficult and you have limited continues, so you really have to learn the game if you want to complete it. And for retro games, it's kind of hard to really devote yourself to one game and really just learn it from back to front. So that could turn some people off. But overall, the mechanics are solid. Like I said, the atmosphere and environments are great. The music is kind of this kind of epic orchestral sounding score, which I really appreciate. So yeah, overall, I would say it's a good game. For the price, I'm not really sure if it's worth it. I think it's like $50 right now. They did re-release this sort of on the PS2 in Japan, and it's also on the Xbox Panzer Dragoon Orta as an unlockable, so those are some other ways to play it, I guess. But yeah, let's move on to the next game. And here we have the sequel, Panzer Dragoon 2 Zwei, which I love the title because Zwei means two in German, so it's kind of redundant in a way, but you gotta love it. It's kind of a more refined version of the original game. It's not much longer. I think you can beat it in like 2 hours or so, but it is much easier to get through, which I appreciate. Like it's not as punishing as the original game. There isn't really that much to say because it kind of follows a similar formula, but I think it's just better in every way, and it's my favorite Panzer Dragoon rail shooter game of the three. 1, 2, and Orta. So, yeah, this is the one I would recommend the most if you were to get a Panzer Dragoon rail shooter game. All right, and here we have kind of a more special game, Panzer Dragoon Saga. So, the rarity and the high cost of the game kind of overshadows the game itself. It's kind of mostly known for being hard to find because famously Sega did not print that many copies of the game because this game came out in 1998 and Sega like infamously abandoned the Saturn in 98. There were only a few releases and they pretty much didn't release any games on their platforms until the Dreamcast came out on that famous day, September 9th, 1999. So there's kind of a year gap where they weren't doing anything. So, and this was one of the last releases on the Saturn. And maybe there's rumored that they only printed about like 20,000 copies in the US, and I think even fewer in Europe. And obviously it's more, there are more of them out there in Japan. We'll get to the Japanese aspect of the Saturn in the next video where I show my Japanese collection, but that's of no use to people who don't know Japanese because this is an RPG, and if you can't read the text, then what's the point of playing an RPG? But yeah, getting into the actual game itself, this was kind of Sega's answer to Final Fantasy VII, which came out the previous year and kind of took the world by storm and really put RPGs in the West on a mainstream level. I would say they were kind of a niche thing before Final Fantasy VII, and Pokemon came out in 1998 in the U.S. at least, and that kind of took RPGs to another level afterwards. But yeah, this game obviously, like I said, it didn't sell well, so it wasn't on the level of a Final Fantasy VII impact wise, but it is a really good game. It kind of gives you the ability to explore the Panzer Dragoon lore better than a rail shooter, because in a rail shooter you can only do so much. You're just going forward and shooting things, but in an RPG you can talk to characters and stuff like that, so it's just easier to absorb more of the lore. And basically it kind of combines rail shooters with RPGs, so you are controlling your dragon still, but then there are also random battles where you encounter enemies and attempt to defeat them in a turn-based style RPG battle system, which is neat. And the funny thing is that this is a 4-disc game, but it's a very short RPG, all things considered. It's like a 20-hour game, I would estimate. So despite having all those discs, it's a very short game. It's just that a lot of the space on those discs are taken up by cutscenes and stuff like that. But yeah, overall, it is a very good game. Obviously, the question some people would have is it worth the money? I think, I don't know how much it's worth now. It might be like $500 or something, $600. I would say very few games, if any, are worth that much. So my answer would be no. But it is worth playing in a vacuum, like price aside. So I mean, there obviously are ways to play it. I mean, you could play it through an emulator. You could borrow it from someone. You could you could do a really weird thing and just buy the game on eBay and then sell it when you're done, because you are guaranteed to get your money back. And the game does increase in value pretty much every time I look at it. So I don't know. You could do one of those three. And deep down, I do think that Sega will eventually re-release this game. There's some definite hurdles there because they lost the source code, unfortunately. So they can't just simply remake it. They would, or at least re-release it that easily. They would have to either emulate it or reverse engineer it, and that kind of takes a lot of effort for a game that not a lot of people know about to begin with. So I think they're worried that they wouldn't make their money back. But I do think it'll come out eventually, just because, I mean, people never thought that there would be a Shenmue 3. People never thought Shenmue 1 and 2 would never be re-released, but those did happen. So I do think this game will kind of reach a new audience eventually, which is a good thing, because pretty much everyone missed this game, including me, obviously, until pretty recently. But yeah, it's a game I do recommend, independent of the price anyway. If you can find a way to play it for cheap, I would. Alright, so here we have one of my favorite games ever, and definitely my favorite game on the Saturn, Nights into Dreams. This is the game I wanted a Saturn for. This is the game I'd heard about online. People had always sort of talked about this in the background. It was that weird Sonic team game that didn't involve Sonic. Their other mascot character. So basically, from what I understand, Sega was trying to position Knights as the new Sonic, at least in the US, for the Saturn, because they couldn't get a Sonic game out on their own due to the internal issues I talked about earlier. They kind of made this new franchise, Knights, and obviously it wasn't as successful as Sonic, and I think there are a few reasons for that. One, I think that the design of Knights is confusing. Even though I think Knights as a character is an appealing character, like, I don't think it's easy to explain to people like who Knights is exactly, because it's kind of this weird purple jester creature thing, kind of like Klonoa in a way. I think Klonoa didn't do well on PlayStation because it was kind of this weird character that, like, you couldn't really tell who it is. It's like, is it a rabbit? Is it a cat? Like, what is this thing? But I also think it didn't do well because it's kind of hard to understand the mechanics at first because it's not like Sonic or Mario where you just try to get to the goal and you're done with the level. It's kind of this weird score based game where you have to collect these little marble gem things and put it into this container to be able to advance to the next part of the level. It's a pretty simple one button game, kind of like Sonic actually. Sonic was a one button game as well. And yeah, it's just not easy to immediately understand the hook of the game. And like I said with the Panzer Dragoon part of the video, I think Sega was a little behind the curve in terms of what console players wanted. Because even with the release of the NES, I think the idea of scores in video games was kind of passé. Like, Super Mario Bros. Had a score system, but no one ever paid attention to it. And like, I just don't think score is a good motivator for people on console anyway. And the fact that Knights is a very score-based game, it kind of just shows me that Sega was in a completely different... They were on a different wavelength than Sony and Nintendo and other third-party developers, so it just didn't work out for them in terms of making a new successful franchise. But I love Knights because once you do understand the mechanics and wrap your head around, you know, the way they work, I just think it's super smooth. I love the sense of flight in the game. I love the environments. They're very surreal and dreamlike. And of course, Knights is a very dream-centric... It has a very dream-centric tone to it. I love the music. It's very bittersweet. It makes you happy and kind of sad at the same time. Kind of like Klonoa. I feel like those two are kind of connected in some way, those two franchises. But yeah, it's just a great game. One of my favorite games ever. And yeah, I also wanted to show another Knights related thing. This is kind of a sampler disc called Christmas Nights into Dreams. I think it was distributed mainly through like Sega magazines and things like that. I don't think this was actually sold in stores, at least in the US. It might have been in Japan, but yeah, it's basically a Christmas themed Nights where you have to play through a couple of levels and you can unlock things. Like, you can even unlock the ability to play through these Christmas themed Nights levels as Sonic, which is really cool. But yeah, this is something I play every holiday season. It's just like a fun tradition. And yeah, it's, even though it's not a full game, it's just something I really appreciate. And you might want to get the Japanese version just because it comes in a full disc CD case. And it's a lot cheaper, whereas the US one comes in this little cardboard sleeve, which is pretty fragile. But yeah, Knights, a great game. And they did release Knights on Wii. They made a new game, and it's a pretty controversial game. I don't think a lot of people like that game. I actually thought it was okay. I think the problem is that they just make you play as the human kids a little too much. And also, Knights has a human voice, which really freaked me out back then, but it's not that bad. I'd give that one a shot too. It's very cheap. So yeah, Knights unfortunately never caught on, but he does live on in some of the Sega spin-off games, like the racing games, and he's in Sonic Lost World, or at least there's a Knights themed Sonic Lost World level, and there's a Knights pinball level in Sonic Adventure. So Knights does live on, even though he wasn't the mascot that Sega needed at the time. You know, especially because that same year people were playing Crash Bandicoot, and more importantly, Super Mario 64. Like, Mario 64, not only is it one of the best games ever, but it's one of the most revolutionary games ever. So kind of that didn't really help Knights. I think people just compared those three mascot games and set Knights aside because for the reasons I stated earlier. Crash, I would say Knights is much better than Crash, but Mario 64 is kind of an untouchable game for many reasons. But oh yeah, one more thing I wanted to say about this before we move on to the next game. Knights came with, or at least there were some Knights games that were bundled with a 3D controller, which is kind of like a prototype to the Dreamcast controller. It has like this space pod kind of aesthetic to it. And I would definitely play Knights that way because I've tried playing Knights with a traditional Saturn D-pad, and it just did not play well. So if you were to get Knights, I would really recommend getting the 3D controller. And they did re-release Knights on PS2 and Xbox 360 and PS3 and PC. In my opinion, those aren't as good as the original Saturn version, because something about the controls felt off, and I feel like the graphics were a little too clean. And I don't know, I just think the weird Saturn 3D graphics mesh well with the surreal tone of the game. I don't. It's hard to explain. I'm not just trying to be like some like pretentious jerk who always liked the original version, but for Knights, I really do feel like the Saturn version is the best one, and it's not too expensive because it was one of the better selling games on the Saturn, which unfortunately isn't saying much. But yeah, this is definitely a staple. There's really no reason not to get Knights if you were to get a Saturn. All right, next up we have Saturn Bomberman. Unfortunately, I do not have the manual, so I'm going to turn the game around just so it can look a little better on camera. So obviously there are a billion versions of Bomberman. I think people at first glance would just wonder why this game would be worth getting at all. I mean, it's just kind of a 2D traditional Bomberman game. But weirdly enough, this is probably one of the most, actually it is the most highly regarded version of Bomberman out there, to my estimation. Part of that is, as you can see on the back of the box, the ultimate 10-player party game. Weirdly enough, this game does support 10 players, and that requires a special multi-tap to do so easily anyway. And it's shaped like a Bomberman, which makes it look really funny. But yeah, it's just a really solid 2D Bomberman game. And the only problem I have with this game is that I'm not in a situation where I know a ton of people who play retro games and who are really enthusiastic about playing games like this. So I can't get 9 other people to play Saturn Bomberman with me. And of course I don't have 10 controllers, obviously. So this is basically a game you can play at conventions, or if you're lucky enough to have a lot of like hardcore retro gaming friends, but unfortunately I do not have those things. Conventions I actually try to go to once a year. I went to MagFest for the first time last year, and it was pretty awesome. So I'm going to try to make a habit of going to a convention more often. But yeah, I would say this probably is the best 2D Bomberman game. But unfortunately, it's very expensive. I think it's over $200. And I don't think any Bomberman game is worth $200 because, like I said, there are just so many versions of the game. You can get a pretty good version of Bomberman for pretty cheap. Like, they released one recently on Switch, and it's soon coming out on Xbox One and PS4. And I would probably recommend those because those are online and they're cheaper. So I don't know. It is a great game, but it's just hard to justify buying just due to the price tag. All right, and next up we have Virtua Fighter 2. So this is Sega's premier fighting franchise. Unfortunately, there hasn't been a new Virtua Fighter in many years, but it was a hot series for them for a while, because I think it might have been the first 3D fighting game ever, or at least true 3D fighting game. So it was kind of a pioneer in that regard. And basically, kind of one of the trademarks of the Virtua Fighter series is that it's more realistic than most fighting games, I would say. Not that it's completely realistic, obviously, but it is more martial arts based. It's not as flashy and crazy as something like a Marvel vs. Capcom or even the Soul Calibur. The series is compared to other 3D fighters like Soul Calibur and Tekken. Tekken and Soul Calibur, I feel like you can button mash a bit, and your character will do a lot of awesome moves, and it's more fluid and kind of easier to get into in a way. Whereas Virtua Fighter, they're more technical, they're a little more stiff. They're more methodical. They're harder to learn. And like I said, they're not flashy, so they might not grab a casual player's attention as much as something like a Soul Calibur. But with that being said, I think the Virtua Fighter games are really fun. Like I said, they do take a while to learn, but once you do learn them, they're really satisfying to play. And yeah, there isn't too much to say other than I think the Saturn port is very impressive. The 3D looks really nice. It's just a fun game to pick up and play, and it's a very cheap Saturn game, and that's always a bonus for reasons I stated earlier. I just think Saturn games are way too expensive right now. So I would say this is another staple too if you were to get a Saturn, just because it's a fun game and it is cheap, like I said. Yeah, I would definitely recommend this one. All right, and kind of related to Virtua Fighter is Fighter's Megamix, which plays a lot like Virtua Fighter 2. I think it's on the same engine because, like I said, it does play very similarly. But unlike Virtua Fighter, this is kind of a Sega All Stars version of that, where it has a lot of different characters from different Sega franchises. So you could theoretically have a match between a Daytona car, and I think Sonic is in the game too. I'm not sure. I don't want to speak out of turn, so I'm not going to definitely say if Sonic is in there, but I know the Daytona car is in there. So it's more, I think for that reason, it's a little bit more casual friendly than Virtua Fighter because it is a little wackier while still retaining the Virtua Fighter mechanics. So this is another game I would definitely recommend, like Virtua Fighter 2, it's a pretty cheap game. So yeah, not too much to say other than I do really like this game. And finally, for my US collection, we have Guardian Heroes, which is a 2D beat 'em up made by kind of a legendary developer named Treasure. Unfortunately, they're not really around anymore. They still kind of make ports here and there of their older games, but they were mainly known for being like an offshoot of Konami, and they really specialized in making action games. So stuff like Gunstar Heroes, Silhouette Mirage, Mischief Makers on N64, Sin and Punishment, and a game I'll get into in my other video, Radiant Silvergun, and then Ikaruga, which is one of the most famous shoot 'em up games of all time. So they do have a really high pedigree, and this is a really great game because it kind of takes a genre that was stale at that point, the beat 'em up genre, and add a little bit more flavor to it. It's kind of an RPG beat 'em up in the same vein as something like Castle Crashers is now, and I think Scott Pilgrim. I think that game is similar too, where you just kind of beat up enemies and gain levels and kind of upgrade. It makes it more satisfying in a way. It gives it a little bit more depth than something like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Arcade or Simpsons Arcade. So for that reason, I think it's a really good game. And of course, it's a multiplayer game, so it's best enjoyed with a friend. But like I said, it's hard to find friends who will play Sega Saturn games with you because it is a niche console and not that many people even know about these games. So hopefully you're lucky enough to have like a retro gaming friend who's willing to try out new games with you. Unfortunately, I do not have one of those at the moment, really. Like when I'm playing games with my friends, it's usually stuff that we grew up with, like Nintendo 64 games like Smash Brothers and Mario Party, or newer games, or stuff like that. So that is one element of retro game, purchasing, and you have to know in advance if you have people to play with. But other than that, it is a great game, and it is another expensive game, unfortunately. But they did re-release this on Xbox Live Arcade. And I think it's backwards compatible on the Xbox One, so this game does live on. And they did make a Game Boy Advance pseudo-sequel, I think, Guardian Heroes. I can't remember the name. I can't remember the name of it, but yeah, I actually haven't heard that many good things about the GBA game. But yeah, it's definitely a great game, and would recommend playing it either on the Saturn or XBLA. Alright, that does it for my US Saturn collection. As you can tell, I don't have that many of them, but due to how much they cost, I only get one or two a year, maybe. So that explains that. But yeah, I'm releasing another video right after this one, showing off my Japanese Saturn games. So please do check that out if you're interested, because as most Saturn fans know, the Japanese aspect of the Saturn is where it's at. So please do if you enjoyed watching this video. But until then, take care, and hope to see you there.